Over the weekend, I went to MythicCon Charlotte, and I literally played the Animist for 24 hours. And after all of that gameplay, I want to share with you what I've learned. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben, you here for another Pathfinder 2e video, and today I want to talk about the Animist. I am absolutely in love with this class, and I think more people should be talking about this. I think the Exemplar is kind of the star of the show right now in terms of where everyone's attention is, but I want to draw a little bit more attention to the Animist today. And I want to start by actually referencing a video about a wizard. Pathfinder recently put a video out about the wizard, and some of the things that he said about the wizard I think are going to apply to the Animist. He kind of talks about how the wizard is this Batman style character who, with correct time and preparation and knowledge, can be prepared for everything, but also that the class can have a really, really unforgiving skill floor because a lot of information is required to play the class optimally and plan out everything that could possibly be happening for your character. And I think a lot of that is going to follow through to talking about the Animist as well, as it is another very, very complicated spellcaster class that has the possibility to be prepared for just about anything. The Animist itself has absolutely insane levels of customization and flexibility. You have some prepared spell slots that can allow you to kind of select for what you are expecting to see in that day. You have the ability to select two and then later three apparitions that are going to give you additional spontaneous spell slots, as well as some lores that are going to be flexible on any given day. You are going to be able to change your focus spell at will, allowing you to change what focus spells that you have access to. And so you are going to be this character that has flexibility to plan for a day, to plan for a scenario within that day by swapping your primary apparition, and hence change your focus spells. You can adjust your lores as needed from a day-to-day basis, like, okay, you're going to a volcano or a mountain, or that you're going to be on a ship. You have such massive ability to change your character to fit the scenarios that you're going to be playing. And you're really not locked into very many of the choices that you make, as with a day's time worth of preparation, you can basically just respec your character, which is a wild thing to say. While many classes are prepared casters that really can switch up the feel of their character from day to day, you kind of have another level of flexibility on top of that because you can even change your skill trainings. One of the apparitions can just instantly, like, bam, now I am really good at, I think it's thievery and crafting, and I can set up my own little workshop to do those things, and you can adjust your lores. Like, this class is absolutely awesome. And I think having that ability to adjust so wildly to scenarios is going to make the Animist one of the strongest classes for Pathfinder Society play in particular. When you sign up for a Pathfinder Society event, you often get a little prompt that's like, okay, hey, this is where this is going to take place. Here's a 2 or 3 sentence blurb about what's going on. And sometimes you'll get more information in the introduction, and then you can prepare your spell slots and your lores accordingly. I played a scenario this weekend where I knew in advance mountain lore was going to be good. And I have played scenarios in the past where I would know that sailing lore was going to be good. You get to adapt so hard to the scenarios that are coming. And so, in terms of what you should be expecting from an Animist, in a word, let's do 2 words. It's unprecedented flexibility in your character. The Animist apparitions are really cool. And here's a little cheat sheet I made um, to talk about the apparitions as they are as of level 1. Now, these apparitions are all going to give more spells than this later on, but kind of at a glance, when you are first building your Animist, this is the stuff that is on the table. And your Animist has access to all 11 of these apparitions every day, and you can swap them out every day, most of the time without any sort of penalty, although there's one apparition sort of subtrack that you can go down as an Animist, where you always keep one specific apparition prepared. But outside of that, you always have access to all of these. And on paper, the class fantasy of the Animist is that, every day you are maybe switching your apparitions to completely new things and swapping through all of these. But after playing in quite a few scenarios, so I played in 3 different Pathfinder Society scenarios, and then I did the level 3 to 5 Malevolence adventure. I think there's a longer name for the ones that take 12 hours that are essentially 3 sessions long. But I played through a very slightly edited version of that as well. And I pretty much ended up sticking with the same 2 apparitions for most of my time in playing all of these. I think that's partially because I picked the good ones when I was designing my initial character build that I was going to default to, but also because I don't think most Animists are actually going to swap to all of these. And that's because even though you have access to all of these, your raw stats probably need to be different to take advantage of some of these. So let's talk about Witness to Ancient Battles, for example. So this is the one that is going to give you Shield and Sure Strike, as well as a focus spell that you can keep sustaining to gain Reactive Strike and better than normal proficiency with your weapons. This is something that is going to make sure that you want to be in the medium armor that your class is qualified for, and you're probably going to want a higher strength score if you go down this route. And similarly, there's some other melee focused, maybe not as melee intensive ones that give you some sort of innate attack, such as Lurker in the Devouring Dark, giving you a tentacle attack with a 10-foot reach. I think it begins as a 10-foot grapple and then later becomes an actual attack, if memory serves. But I think that the stat spread for the average Animist is not necessarily going to be set up to take advantage of this. And indeed, even though the Animist has access to medium armor, the Animist that I played did not have the stats to qualify for medium armor. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at that? So the Animist is going to give you access to a ton of different lore skills, right? And your various lore skills are going to benefit from having additional points of intelligence. The way that I built my specific Animist, I ended up having 7 different lores available to me at level 1. 4 of those coming from my apparitions, 1 of those coming from my background, 1 of those coming from the Elven lore feat, and then the pillar background as well gives you the additional lore skill feat. So I went a little bit harder on lores than the average build might, but I think lores are very, very good. Information is king in a teamwork-based game, and the more information your team has, the better you can do at taking down, your various skill challenges, your recall knowledge checks, and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, let's go back to the abilities. Now, I intended on playing my Animist as a sort of support character that has sort of a blaster secondary role. And I wanted to make sure I could take advantage of all of these lores that I had. So I wanted to make sure that I had at least 2 intelligence. And this was going to mean that I had more skill trainings as well, making me a very, very, very strong teammate as far as skill challenges would go. So with wisdom as our primary stat, we've got to max that out. We need a 4 in that. And I could go hard on strength to get that medium armor. But if I do that, then I might not have as high of bonuses to my various skills that I want to be taking. And the Animist can have an absolute ton of skill trainings, especially when you consider the lores as a part of that as well. And I wanted to boost up the various deck space skills, such as thievery and stealth. And so I wanted to keep dexterity. So I got my dexterity to a 3 to make sure that I would be fine in light armor. And I chose an elf for my background as a way to get that second point of intelligence that I otherwise might not have been able to fit into my build. That came with a con flaw that I really needed to balance out a little bit later on in the build. And if we start looking like, okay, well, how am I going to get strength onto this character? And the answer is you're probably not. So the way that I have built my particular Animist is that I sacrificed strength and kind of ignored charisma in order to make my skills good. But someone who wants to be primarily using a melee-oriented Animist build is probably going to put points into strength where I put points into dexterity, and is not going to end up with the same boost to their lores that my character did. So when you are going and building your Animist, from the get-go, think, how much of the time do I want to spend in melee? Because if the answer is like, yeah, I really do want to have the option to just get in there and go bonk when I need to, then you probably want much more strength and con than an Animist who wants to be more of a party support role might be needing. So, stats aside, the other thing that you should be thinking about in terms of apparitions is that you can switch between your primary and secondary apparition when you refocus. And the primary benefit you're going to get of switching between, your first apparition and your second apparition being your primary versus secondary one is which focus spell you are using. 10 minutes is not a long time in the grand scheme of a Pathfinder game. But you can change that 10 minutes to a single action with one feat that might not even cost you a feat slot to take. The Circle of Spirits feat allows you for a single action to change which one of your apparitions is your primary apparition. And this gives you in-battle flexibility. So let's say that you have one support spirit and one kind of like active combat-oriented spirit. Like you might have one that heals and one that deals damage. Well, sometimes within a single combat, your needs might change. The tide of battle might be changing in a way that's negative for you, and you might want to be able to switch to your focus spell that heals. But you might want to start out the battle being able to dish out damage, or maybe doing something defensive that is for you specifically. And I think the Circle of Spirits feat is very, very, very strong. And I would personally probably take this on every single Animist that I ever built. Luckily, the Liturgist just gives you this for free. So one of the subtracts just gives you the Circle of Spirits feat. The Liturgist, in my opinion, is the strongest of the options to take for the Animist. And I think this one should be your default choice in building Animists, unless you have a build-specific reason why you really, really want one of the others. So, for example, if you know that you want a familiar on your character for one reason or another, like there is a subtract specifically for that. But otherwise, I highly, highly, highly recommend Liturgist. And I used Circle of Spirits much more than I expected. I kind of thought most of the time that I would go and just like, okay, I'm going to use my one for battle. I'll get out of battle. I'll refocus, get that focus point back, and then I'll, use my other focus spell to heal people. When in reality, I actively wanted to use my third action to switch which one was my primary apparition very, very frequently, like multiple times within a 4-hour scenario for sure. And I think another benefit of being a liturgist or taking the Circle of Spirits feat is that because you can just swap your primary apparition for a single action, you are never going to have to spend 10 minutes refocusing purely to go and switch which apparition you have so that you can be prepared for the upcoming scenario or so that you can change to the apparition that is going to give you healing. While Pathfinder Society games are often pretty forgiving in terms of how much time is allowed between scenarios, sometimes you will be on slightly tighter rails than just that. And if you need to spend 20 or 30 minutes to go and, like, okay, I need to refocus so I can switch to my healing spell, then I'm going to use my healing spell, and then I'm going to refocus again to get that focus point back. You might end up slowing down your party if you are on any sort of real timer. And this last tip here is specifically for people who are using Path Builder. Okay, so your Animist focus spell is going to appear in this tab, okay? And right now it's on Earth's Bile because I have Steward of Stone and Fire here. So I'm going to try to switch my primary apparition here to the Custodian of Groves and Gardens. So I hit accept. And sometimes it's not actually going to change out this spell. It did this time. It did switch it to Garden of Healing. But when I was playing on my iPad, sometimes in order to get this to change and in order to get in order to get my spells to refresh over here, if you take a look at this, I have half as many spells as I should. You might need to kind of refresh or go out of something in order to get everything to appear. Like if you notice now my focus spell tab has disappeared. So you might need to switch off to something else and then switch back to what you want so that you actually end up displaying all of your spells and your focus spell appropriately. Just kind of be aware that that is a slightly annoying quirk of being able to quickly switch your apparitions back and forth. And if anyone knows a more elegant way to do that that gets around things sometimes disappearing, let me know down in the comments below, because I'm going to be playing a lot of this character moving forward. Okay, so now I want to do a little bit of a tier list of apparitions. And I don't really think tier lists are great in terms of content. I think tier lists often suppress information and try to oversimplify things. But I think there are a couple of apparitions that stand out above the rest and a couple that are clearly below the rest. So I'm going to talk about the ones that I think are the best and the ones that I think about that are like clearly the worst. And then most of the ones in the middle are like totally fine and good and totally reasonable still. And in my mind, the two standout ones are the Custodian of Groves and Gardens and the Steward of Stone and Fire. These were the ones that I spent pretty much the entire weekend having as my default choices for my Animist Edgar. And the primary reason that I just absolutely love Custodian of Grove and Gardens is because you trivialize out of combat healing in a way that most other characters just don't. So, Garden of Healing at level 1, my Animist is now level 3. At level 1, in a 10-foot emanation, heals each creature for 1d4 hit points, and for every spell level that you gain, it is going to heighten by 1d4. And it has a little rider on it so that any creature that has been affected by its healing gains a +1 bonus to saves against emotion effects for 10 minutes, but does not receive additional healing from additional castings of this spell while the bonus persists. Note that casting and sustaining are different, so that you can continue to sustain this spell and the creatures can keep benefiting from that healing. But if for some reason you stop casting this, you stop sustaining it, and then you cast it again, those creatures who already benefited from it because this spell has ended can't be healed from it again. But assuming that you continue to heal people with this, this is an absurd amount of out of combat healing that requires no rolls with it. And like, yes, I know that you are rolling dice to restore hit points with that, but what I mean is that there is zero chance of failure. When you roll something like battle medicine or treat wounds, there is some percentage of the time where you fail. Maybe it's only going to be on a nat 1 if you are particularly incredible at medicine, but there is still some chance of failure. And that just doesn't happen here. And with something like treat wounds, there is a very, very large difference between what happens on a success and what happens on a crit. I'm going to tell you that mathematically speaking, it doesn't really matter what you roll here. So the average roll on a d4 is 2.5, right? So if you can sustain this for 1 minute for, 10 rounds, that is on average 25 hit points. And 25 hit points is more than what the vast, vast majority of level 1 characters are going to have. So even on your average roll, you just go and pop everyone up to full health or something that does not cost you any real resource. Your focus points are easily renewable from battle to battle, whereas something like a spell slot for a heal spell isn't. And things like treat wounds or battle medicine have a real timer before they can be reused again. And Garden of Healing is just honestly kind of cracked. So once I realized how the math of this worked, I just straight up asked my GM, I'm like, hey, do I even need to roll this on my average roll? We're going to just full heal the entire party. Can we just skip this roll? And every time the GM was just like, yeah, that's fine. This spell is insane. So if you want to save a little bit of time for your table and not just roll 10d4 every combat, consider asking for that tiny bit of leeway from your GM. Now, beyond that, the Custodian of Groves and Gardens also comes with a perfectly reasonable first level spell slot. Protector Tree is a spell that I like a lot. This can be a way to kind of preemptively protect some allies so that you can continue to use actions to blast or whatever and not, be forced to use your following turn to heal. I really, really like Protector Tree. And then the other one that I think stands out quite a bit is Steward of Stone and Fire. This gives you a fantastic early cantrip in the form of Ignition. This is a great offensive option, and if you get yourself into melee range, it can be rolling d6s instead of d4s. And the Earth's Bile focus spell is quite good at making you into a real damage dealer. So Earth's Bile, for a single action, kind of does a pseudo-electric arc style effect that can potentially hit multiple enemies. 30-foot range, 10-foot burst, reflex save, sustained for up to a minute. The first time you cast it, and then each turn when you sustain it, you choose an area to do the effect on. Each creature in the area is getting 1d4 fire damage, 1d4 bludgeoning damage, and if they fail, they also take a persistent fire damage as well. And this one doesn't heighten every level, it heightens every other level. But when I was playing at, third level, it still felt perfectly fine dealing the damage that it dealt. And at first level, when we first got started, this felt extremely, extremely strong. It doesn't heighten, super, super, super well or anything, but this is a really good third action to be using within a combat. And if you stay on this apparition as you level up, you will eventually pick up everyone's favorite blasting spell, Fireball, at 3rd level. And while Fireball does have its own downsides, small rooms that are common to Pathfinder Society games being one of the primary ones, it does sure like to incinerate large groups worth of foes. So those two apparitions became my default for my literal 24 hours of playing the Animist this weekend. And I was willing to change out those apparitions, but this combination and the ability to switch back and forth between them within combats meant that I had awesome healing options or sustaining healing over time, and I had a really good offensive third action as well. But there were two of these that I basically never really considered using at all. The first of those being Echo of Lost Moments. I am not excited about gaining access to either Figment or Deja Vu, and its focus spell is honestly just straight up confusing to me. So it sounds like it should be good. So for a single action, you can gain an additional reaction that you can use for any animist or apparition reaction you have. But what animist or apparition action are you going to have, especially at low level play? So I think that the vast majority of the time that this focus spell just does nothing. A lot of the reactions that you can get require a different primary apparition, and hence you would not have access to this focus spell. So, for example, you can get Reactive Strike, but you can't have two Reactive Strikes because you would need two primary apparitions in order to do so. And I believe that there is a feat or feat chain that you can take so that you can end up with multiple primary apparitions, but that's not happening immediately. And so the combination of bad granted spells and a borderline useless focus spell make me unlikely to ever take this one while playing the Animist unless I really specifically need one of those lores for the day. And then the other one that I'm not really excited about is the Stalker in Darkened Boughs. I think it gives you like quite reasonable lores, but I'm not super excited about Runic Body. Gouging Claw is fine, but I'm not really excited about Runic Body. And I think Pest Form is pretty terrible. If you are in a, role play focused campaign where you want to, turn into little pests and sneak around or whatever, that's all fine and good. But for something like Pathfinder Society play, I don't really think this is where I want to be. So I think this can be a fine secondary apparition if you need the lore specifically, but I want to be excited about the focus spell if I am going to be taking an apparition, and I am just really not with this one. So I see myself avoiding those two. On my specific Animist, I am probably not going to be excited about Witness to Ancient Battles most of the time. There may be exceptions to that. For example, I should not give names here. In one of the things that I played, heraldry lore was absolutely relevant, and you may want to combine some spells between your apparitions. So, for example, using Sure Strike to make it so that something like Ignition or another attack spell that you get from one of your other apparitions actually has a higher chance to hit and do its thing is perfectly reasonable. But I think most of the apparitions, beyond the ones that I've talked about here, fall into a perfectly usable, like, middle range. I'm not the most excited about the devouring dark form tentacle thing that it gets from its focus spell, but I quite like the lores that it gets, and I think the spells that it grants are totally fine and good. And sometimes you will really know that the lores are going to hit home and be very strong. And I think for most of these, their focus spells are good, making you more difficult to hit in one way or another because someone is attacking with disadvantage or they get confused and can't hurt you specifically. I think there is a lot to like about most of these apparitions. All right, let's talk about strengths and weaknesses of the Animist now. I think quite clearly, based on what I've been saying so far in this video, its extreme flexibility is going to be one of its biggest strengths because you have flexibility from day to day by changing your apparitions. You have flexibility within a combat, even by changing your primary apparition, having different focus spells. And so you are going to end up with a character that is probably going to be very flexible, very, very good in skill challenges due to all of your various lores, and probably a decent number of skill trainings as well. Your character is probably going to be a good fit at any table, even if you don't necessarily change your character to fit that table specifically. You have top tier out of combat healing, and you're very good at preserving resources for a long adventuring day. I was finding that like my wizard and my sorcerer companions that I was playing with were often pretty tapped out by the end of scenarios, and I often found that I still had most of my top level spells remaining at the end of a day because my focus spells were so good and because I had a really solid range of cantrips to make it so that I didn't necessarily have to expend spell slots to feel like I was doing reasonable amounts of contribution to the fights. But as far as weaknesses go, I do think the Animist has two of them. And the first one is that I think the Animist is mad. And I don't mean angry, I mean multi attribute dependent. So why don't we go ahead and go back to our abilities for a minute to talk about this? So obviously, your Animist needs wisdom for spell save reasons, right? Well, your Animist is probably going to need dexterity or strength for armor, and dexterity or strength to hit, and con to stay alive, and intelligence to boost those lores. So I really feel like you need 4 out of the 6 skills on any given Animist. And a lot of times, a character really only needs one stat, and then you just worry about your armor, and then you start going into your HP. But it feels like so many stats are just important here because of all of these lores that you are getting. Now, like you could ignore your intelligence, and then you are going to feel less of that strain of ability levels. But like you have so many lores, and they are quite good lores that you just randomly get access to. And I think ignoring those is a mistake. But you definitely will feel some tension in trying to figure out how you are going to place your stats for this character. And for example, I am not wearing the medium armor that I could be wearing on this character because of that tension in trying to get everything that I want for this character. And I think the secondary weakness of the Animist is that you aren't the best at bursts of doing things. Let's compare to a cleric for a second. So a cleric gains a whole bunch of extra spell slots that specifically can be used for heal or harm. And let's focus on healing here. While the Animist can cast heal, the cleric can cast heal more. So if what you specifically want is burst healing inside of a combat, something like a cleric might do that a little bit better. And if you are thinking about burst damage, your spell slots aren't always going to be used for the exact same thing. So let's see what my good friend Edgar here, my Animist, had prepared previously in the last session that I played. So I had a heal, a runic weapon, and a revealing light. So I had a burst heal, a support spell, and a hey, let's deal with randomly invisible enemies or otherwise weaken a boss spell. And then over on my apparition spells, I did not have deja vu, which which I would have had access to two defensive things in my first rank spell slot. Gentle Breeze doesn't really do anything, so my second rank spell slot was kind of a blasting thing. And I think in my previous scenario, I was playing at level 4, so I also had access to heal and harm in these slots. So you might not always have a blasting option or a healing option available here that does good burst stuff. Embodiment of the Balance can really help out with that by adding heal and harm to those slots. But sometimes you are going to find that the slots that you have available aren't used for the exact thing that you want them to be used for, especially if you do a bad job of predicting what you are going to want. And I was finding that sometimes my damage might lag behind, say, like a sorcerer who has what is it, potent sorcery, I think it is, that just adds flat damage to the spells that you cast. I was finding that my spell slot damage might be a little bit behind some of my comrades who might do something like that, or like a 3-action force barrage that was always going to hit and just be a very, very consistent damage dealer. So I felt like I was very good at helping to deal with crowds between some of the cantrips that I had and my Earth's Bile focus spell. I felt like I was very good at helping with crowds, but when we got to a single target boss enemy, I sometimes felt like I was really relying on the other players to reduce the life total of the boss, while I was the one kind of propping them up and supporting them. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it is just something to be aware of that you won't always be the big damage dealer. Okay, how about some practical build advice now? I think extra cantrips are very, very, very good on animists because unlike most other classes, your cantrips are going to change wildly from day to day if you are switching back and forth between different apparitions. And that means that many of your just go to staple actions are going to change from day to day. And you might not always have the most consistent damage dealing. And you might feel like your actual animist prepared cantrip slots feel a little strained if you don't have some additional cantrips from somewhere else. I personally went with an ancient elf on my build, and I did this so that I could take the druid dedication at level 1. This was going to give me 2 primal cantrips as well as some additional skill trainings. And this meant that I could do something like pick up Electric Arc at level 1. This is the level 3 stats, so it's 2d4 normally. And if you have Electric Arc, as long as the thing that you're shooting isn't good at reflex saves, you can do something like blast it with Electric Arc and then blast it with Earth's Bile to do a lot of damage to multiple targets early on in a fight. And then I also picked up Frostbite so that I could have a 60-foot range cantrip, because sometimes you don't want to be moving because you're going to be doing something like using Circle of the Spirits or potentially entering into a channeler's stance to make it so that you do additional damage with Earth Spile. And that was my way that I went and picked up some extra cantrips. And obviously, there's other ways that you can pick up additional cantrips. But if you find good cantrips from somewhere else, then you're probably less locked in to taking one of either Steward of Stone and Fire or Lurker in the Devouring Dark to have a really good offensive cantrip option every day. And so, since I had cantrips covered from other sources, I could use my prepared cantrip slots to focus on utility. So I usually had Guidance and Detect Magic as my 2 Animist cantrips for most of the time. At level 2, I personally picked up the Arcane Sense feat so that I could get innate detect magic as well. In terms of early game class feats, you do have some options. I personally really like embodiment of the balance so that you can add heal and harm to your apparition spell repertoire. That gives you a lot of flexibility. And on days where you have a bad apparition prepared, where your spell slots don't really line up with the adventure quite right, which will happen from time to time, this gives you a catch all. I'm not sure if you're supposed to learn this one at level 2 or level 4. I played with both. I think Channeler's Stance is pretty reasonable. It really pumps up Earth's bile if you plan to normally have Steward of Stone and Fire prepared. And it also applies to your Healer's Garden. What's it called? It also applies to Garden of Healing, kind of. So the wording here is each time you cast a spell that has the Vitality or Void traits that restores hit points while in this stance. Ooh, wait, hold on. Does it apply to that? I don't think it has a Vitality trait. Yeah, so slight correction. It does not have the Vitality trait, so it does not apply to the initial casting of that spell. Whoops, I accidentally healed my allies for like 2 more HP than I was supposed to in one encounter. Live and learn. Anyway, I really do like Channeler's Stance, though, if you do intend on using Earth's Bile as a blasting option. That ends up adding to a decent amount of damage over time. But this is kind of an action economy tax, so I think it is reasonable to pick up Apparition Sense as well. It's not a like perfect imprecise sense because it's invisible or hidden spirits, haunts, and undead. So it might not apply to, say, an invisible imp. So, like, this will be useful sometimes, but it is somewhat weak as an imprecise sense option. So I still think I do like Channeler's Stance. And if you are not a liturgist, you should probably take Circle of Spirits on your character, either at level 2 or level 4. Now, in talking about Channeler's Stance here, I do want to talk about a Pathfinder Society specific thing. At the beginning of your adventuring day, you get some provisions from the Pathfinder Society, and most of the time as a caster, you will be taking a scroll of heal. Please don't be afraid to ask other players, like, hey, can I have a scroll of heal from someone else? Because you get much more out of a scroll of heal than you do from a potion of equivalent level. And I built my Animist to have nothing in his hands so that I can just walk into combat with something like 2 scrolls available to me immediately. And while that won't be true of every Animist, especially if you are going to be going the, like, I want to have reactive strike and bonk things route on your Animist, picking up some extra scrolls can be really, really useful. And, later on you can start looking at wands and staves as well. Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and go into our conclusion now. So I think the Animist is an incredible class. I love, love, love this class, and I think this class is made for people like me. And by that, I mean people who are knowledgeable about the game, who are willing to do their homework. I think this class is very front loaded in terms of complexity. There are so many spells that you have access to over the course of your career. And by the time that you get up to, 6th, 7th, 8th, ninth level spells, you have just a brain melting amount of flexibility. You are going to have so many spells at your disposal. If you are the person who can just look at a list of spells and just know what most of those things do off the top of your head, like, this character is probably going to be very easy for you to play. But if you are a newer player to Pathfinder or someone who just doesn't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the game, I think this class can feel very overwhelming. I think the Exemplar has dominated conversation recently, and I understand why. It is a very flashy class. It has the rare tag. The Exemplar archetype is, maybe jaw-droppingly good, but I think the Animist brings a lot to the table, and I hope more people end up playing it because I think it is a very, very cool class. But it does kind of have that alchemist problem of really requiring a lot of knowledge to be played optimally. Now, this video focused on the Animist from levels 1 to 5, because that is what I played with this weekend. That's what I really have firsthand experience with. But at higher level play, the Animist is going to continue to open up more and more and more beyond what I did here. I believe beginning at 6th level, you gain access to wandering feats, which can basically be retrained every single day as you swap your apparitions in and out. You can swap your wandering feat to another wandering feat to match up with the apparitions that you have prepared for that day. At 7th level, you will then pick up a third apparition, which is going to vastly increase the number of options that you have available to you. At minimum, adding 2 more lores to your pool every single day. Again, the int definitely matters on this character if you are going to have that many lores. And if you make it all the way to level 10, you are going to get a major boost in strength, because normally for the first 9 levels of the game, you have 1 spell slot in each one of your apparition spell levels for each level. And then at level 10, you move up to a first, second, and third rank apparition spell slot. And that's huge. That is really going to open up your ability to kind of spam lower level spell slots and make you less reliant on using cantrips to make sure that you make it throughout the adventuring day without running out of resources. So I think that's everything that I have to say about the Animist here. I hope you all enjoyed. If you made it this far in the video, please consider giving me a follow. That sort of stuff would mean a lot right now. I am trying to grow this channel and make sure that it is worth my time to continue making Pathfinder content, because I'm really enjoying doing this, but I do want to see this channel grow, and I want to have, maybe opportunities to work with Paizo directly in the future. So with that being said, folks, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. See ya!